So this is our last session, which talks to us a little bit about the main models of the module, and also make some comments about the individual assignment, which is a part of your overall assessment. So in terms of some of the housekeeping issues, there are very few housekeeping issues to talk about. Just one maybe, which is if you have not sent me your 200 words to tell me how you are going to assignment, please do. Obviously, it is optional, but most people who do it get something out of it, and it also helps you to concentrate on what you think you're going to do. Okay. We'll talk a little bit about the main modules, models of the module in organizational behavior. And then I want to make some comments on the individual assignment, just as a reminder to you, or we close. So let's first of all look at the module review, which is really a kind of quick breeze through some of the issues that I think we need to remember from the module. Module is entitled Leadership and Organizational Behavior. So perhaps it could have been titled Organizational Behavior, because leadership is seen as an element of organizational behavior. But organizational behavior, OB, is concerned with obviously the behavior of individuals and groups in an organizational context. It's always concerned about effectiveness. It's always concerned about individuals. It's always concerned about teams. But the thrust of the science of organizational behavior is to try to find ways where organizations can become more effective. Now, you're always thinking, yes, there are many ways to effectiveness, and quite often OB tries to help individuals to become more whole, to have better working lives. But these are seen as a route to overall effectiveness. They're not seen as objectives in themselves. The objective of organizational behavior, if you read where the science focuses, it's about performance towards more effective organizations. We get to know an awful lot about why organization behavior when we tend to look at pictures of old, I'm reminded anyway when I look at pictures of old factories at the start of the Industrial Revolution, when individuals were called in from the fields, when the peasants were brought in to work in these environments, cotton mills in Lancashire and industrial plants across the world. We're brought into sharp focus about how challenging it must have been for the individuals transferring themselves from what must have been a kind of a rural lifestyle. There's no alarm clocks and no clocks. Coming from a very peasant type lifestyle and moving into a more mechanistic type. And the difficulties for the individuals adapting to that, but also the difficulties from organizations trying to make individuals the appendix to the machine. And to me, that's what organizations try to do quite a lot. They try to make individuals form a seamless appendix to the machine. So in other words, the principal goal is efficiency and effectiveness and achieving profits for the organization and maximizing the effectiveness of the organizations. And the science has gone into trying to find ways to make individuals fit more comfortably within that. And that can often mean making individuals be more innovative, more happy, more developed, but it's always developed towards the good of the organization. So that's where the science has gone. And it's been a challenge on both sides because people don't normally fit in, don't wake up and think a 40-year working life is exactly what I want for me. And a certain amount of adaptation happens on both sides. And when we look at organizations, we look at the diverseness of the diversity of direction of organizations. So OB is a fantastic study because organizations are so different. They want to achieve so many different things. The nature of them is so different. So, in fact, having any level of direction, purpose, orientation, control even, when one is trying to manage an organization, is quite a difficult thing. The expression herding mice comes to mind when you realize the differences between organizations and sections in organizations and departments in organizations and down to the individuals in organizations. They are just different. And when you manage across the globe, you realize, looking at this kind of light pollution map, you realize that the movement of people from the fields, from outside of the main city areas into the city areas, and this movement has been all across the Industrial Revolution to today, over the last 200 years, there's been this constant movement away from a more agricultural type lifestyle to a more urban type lifestyle. And all that has changed individuals. We've designed cities, and first we shape our tools, then our tools shape us, and then people become shaped by the environments in which they live. They have longer lives, and this is a management issue for us. They have better health, and this is a real benefit for organizations, but also responsibility. And they have longer lives after they retire, and it becomes a responsibility. So as people, and then the populations of these in these cities, urbanized environments, they have less children. So the demographics mean that the populations grow older, bringing responsibilities to organizations and to governments, and changing the nature of what's happening. So 200 years ago, we had a fairly transient workforce. People didn't live very long, so everybody was roughly around the same age. Now you're going to have people in the organization who very wide age spans. The idea of retirement is today you can become more and more pushed away from into the distance for individuals. So stuff is changing. The backdrops to the management of people in organizations is changing and making organization behavior much more complex. Then when you start to look at individual tastes and desires and what people want, just take a group with you into Starbucks and you realize how different people are. We all like different things. We're very we're more independent, we're more individualistic, and yet at the same time, we're quite different. And these issues affect organizations and the way they're managed, and affect the role of the new manager. Everyone's a different size. Everyone's got different tastes. Everyone's got different needs. We all have a different way of looking at things. There's no one size fits all. And even this picture doesn't accommodate the people who don't have 4 fingers and one thumb. So we all have hugely different needs. And as managers and organization builders, we have a responsibility to accommodate and deal with this difference. But at the same time, everyone's bringing something different as well. So everyone's making a contribution. And diversity of approach and diversity of thought in organizations is a richness. Yet at the same time, it's a massive challenge for individuals to refrain from managing as if one is managing oneself. And that's a big challenge for people who become managers, is to manage people not as they themselves would like to be managed, but to manage people from the perspective of what is the best approach with this individual. So the call on us to lead all this diversity is a really interesting one, and it's an amazing challenge. And we looked in the module at different definitions of leadership. Because we're talking about organizations which are trying to achieve something, any leadership definition will always include the goal. And in Northhouse's book and in Fellins's book, the difference in definition tends to be around whether or not the goal is a common goal or whether it's what you really want them to do. So if you look at things from a very democratic point of view, you see leadership as something which is working towards individuals cooperating together to achieve a common goal. Whereas in Martin and Fellin's book, they tend to see the definition as being getting people to do what you want them to do. So it's important from that perspective to have a philosophy for yourself of which end of that spectrum do you stand. I mean, even those two definitions would inspire quite different behavior in leaders. And such is the difference of approaches that people have. One has to have some kind of a grasp on what one's philosophy is before we step up to the mark to try and to manage any group and to lead any group. But before we begin, we have to think about what kind of regard we have for other people around us. In my experience, the academic books don't help us by ignoring this particular point. From a philosophical perspective, I can't see, and I haven't seen it in my experience, that managers manage effectively over the long run if they don't have a positive regard of the people around them. So in other words, if they don't want the best for the human beings around them, because people will always subtract from you if you're trying to extract from them for your own interest. And if they sense that about you, they will always subtract. You can coerce, but they will always subtract somewhere from you. You won't get the maximum cooperation from individuals. So beginning from a perspective of not what's my style, but inherently as a human being, whoever I'm interacting with, I want the best for them when I'm put in a position of leadership responsibility. Now, there's a debate going on in leadership and management about the difference between leadership and management. And I think it's a kind of a spurious argument because the definition of management is so close to the definitions of leadership. It seems almost pointless. It seems almost like an academic argument rather than something which practically impacts the lives of living managers. So it's one in my experience where I've tended not to get into the fight because I think it's almost like an academic fun exercise rather than something which contributes to the manager's effectiveness or lives. The definition we see here is the one which has been created by Mary Parker Follett. And it's a profound one in a sense because it draws in many of the elements of the leadership theories that we have experienced. And the way, and I think we did it on a flip chart, the way I see Follett's approach as being relative to my own experience. When I joined my organization and I worked as an engineer, I had my operating tasks, which were my time management, my engineering, my routine, my sales, my admin, where I got my results through my own activities. But as I got promoted, 1, 2, 3, 4 promotions in my roles throughout my career, I found that my job was divided into 2 parts. I still retained my operating work, administration and bureaucracy, and engineering tasks. I was getting my results through my own efforts, but a new set of tasks jumped up at me because suddenly I was managing people and getting my results through other people, which meant all of the things on the left-hand side of the model. And I found a pull back towards my task, my operating work. And this was because I wasn't sure of this new role, and I was happy doing my operating tasks, where I got my success from. So the new stuff was often more problematic. Sometimes I had to manage people's performance. Maybe performance wasn't going well, and I had to improve the performance by having uncomfortable conversations with people. But generally speaking, if it was left undone, that kind of work had long-term consequences for the group and for the effectiveness of the unit. So I had to learn how to get a balance between those 2 parts of my work, and it's so important that leaders get that balance right. So what are the questions really when we're faced with all of the different theories that academia has provided for us? Literally over the last 100 years, there's been a plethora of theories that have emerged in organizational behavior and are at our disposal for use. And it can be overwhelming for individuals to look at the theories that are available. Early on, people were seen as either having it or not having it. Leadership was seen as something that you either had or you didn't have. And those theories were really traits that individuals had. And if you could identify those traits, you could hire for it and you could select. And the problem about it often has been is that the individual traits have changed over the period. So we couldn't say for certainty that certain traits became the leader when those traits over the years were actually changing. So what people wanted in their leaders tended to change, obviously, with the changes in society. And some of that would probably match elements of serious events in world history were followed by changes in leadership requirements. So we saw after wartime, people tended to have an exhaustion with a dictatorial type of leadership, and there tended to be rebelliousness against these things. And so there was a kind of a zeitgeist of a time when more dominance was expected, maybe desired, but later a reaction to it appeared. So what tends to be happening in the last 20 years is a much more, let's call it softer, approach to leadership. Maybe a more emotionally intelligent type of leader is expected. And yet at the same time, it's one ingredient. This idea of one size fits all, or a trait that fits all. We shouldn't fall into that, because history has shown us that this is a transient idea, and picking the one thing that makes you a great leader hasn't really worked for people in the past. And in the managerial grid, in the middle of the last century, people moved away from the idea of traits which were really only useful for selection and not really that useful for development. Yet at the same time, the managerial grid sought to achieve a prescription for best type of leadership, which was called team management leadership, and it was described as should actually be 9-9 in the model there. It says 9-1, but it should be a 9-9 leadership, which is concern for people and concern for production, and that was regarded as the best approach, and all of the other styles were regarded as somewhat lesser. And the style of being low concern for people and low concern for production, 1-1, that was regarded as the impoverished style. But again, you have a reminder of Mary Parker Follett, where you have the two elements of concern for production and concern for people. Whereas Follett reminded us that management is the art of getting results through people. So the production and the people were two elements. And you can see her, that leadership styles began to combine her two elements in a description of what was really appropriate and what was not appropriate as leaders. And that was a very interesting development, as people started to focus on the kind of behaviors that were going to achieve the best leaders. In a similar way, the situational leadership model moved away from the idea of the one best style and decided that this was going to be the one best model. That the choosing of the right style was a choice based on criteria of how competent the individual was and how committed the individual was. to the task. And if you found people with very low competence and very low commitment, that required direction, the bottom right-hand corner. But as the individual gained in competence and commitment, then a different style could be appropriate. So our individual who is highly competent and highly committed could be delegated to in S4. And that, in a sense, is a complete contradiction of the previous managerial grid, where that would have been seen as an impoverished style. Whereas this approach is a very positive style of having low supportive behavior to the individual and low directive behavior on the production side. So you're letting the person get on with the job, and because you trust them and because they've got high commitment and you've got high competence. So you can see a different approach in this, a completely different approach in this, but both approaches concentrating on the behavior of the leader. In the last 20 years, we've got a much more emotionally intelligent type approach to leadership, where, as we described in class, reading the room and understanding where people are in terms of their emotions and being a better listener and controlling one's own emotions became very important. And Goldman became one of the most popular approaches. There are probably three main approaches to emotional intelligence. And one of the things that Goldman talks about the ability to change and to use different styles. And he records 6 different styles. But one of the essences of his approach is that one has to be able to read the room carefully enough to understand what change is necessary and which style should be chosen. So he doesn't move terribly far away from where we've been in the past century, but he does emphasize the idea that in order to make these changes and pivots between where the current style is and the preferred and more appropriate style, that the individual leader has to understand and to be able to sense and use their emotional intelligence to listen carefully, divine what's happening with the individuals, and then choose the right approach that will actually make a difference to them. What we've found in the last 20 years is that there's been a shift where power has moved away from leaders towards the followers. And yet the demands of the followers increase exponentially. And the followers have become stronger because of technology. The more technology, the more individuals are independent, and the less any form of hierarchy works. If you think back to previous technological ages, before internet and before email and sophisticated communication systems, managers had considerable power because they had huge information power. Whereas access to information and to contact and to communication has been a real benefit for individuals and an empowerment of individuals. Leaders have become more transparent as a result because they must be. They can be more exposed because individuals have much more information. And thus, because people have access to more information, there's a lowering of respect for leaders. And leaders, in order to retain power, have to have a social contract with the people around them. No longer can they remain as hierarchical order givers. They have to develop a contract with their followers to share power in a way. So when I've got all these theories available to me, how do I choose one to use with my team? Well, again, the answer with this will be, it all depends. I have to read the room. I have to read where my team are. And most importantly as well, I suppose, that a lot of the academic material leaves out the amount of freedom that you have as an individual leader in an organization or in a culture. If I'm working in an Indian culture with a paternalistic culture and a paternalistic style of management, I have to negotiate any deviations I want from that. And if my group are expecting a paternalistic style of management, I have to negotiate any deviations I want to achieve from that. And it's a management of expectations that I have to, I don't have to follow them necessarily, but I will be restrained and restricted and curtailed by the context in which I find myself. So every time I change my context, I have to do a situation appraisal and a negotiation to achieve what I want to achieve and make sure I bring everybody around me with me. We talked also about motivation, and some of the questions that we need to start asking ourselves, I suppose, are questions like, well, what does motivate people? And we did take a look at a comprehensive model of motivation. And the spine of this model across the middle is really that people will put effort into something if they think they can do it, if they think they can achieve performance. So first of all, if the task is too big for them, they give up. So they don't put the effort in if they can't achieve it. They know they can't achieve it. So first of all, can I do it? And the second question that comes into their heads is, if I do the performance, what's going to come out of this for me? What's the outcome? Do I get an outcome? Do I get an extrinsic reward, or do I get an intrinsic reward or punishment? What's the outcome for me? What's in it for me? And the last check on the checklist is the individual. Well, is that outcome something that I care about? Is it important to me? Or is it a punishment that actually I worry about? We look at it from a point of view of punishment or reward. So that quick flash series of questions goes through a person's mind. And we broke it down in between each step. The motivation to performance, will I be able to do it? Well, you always want the individual to be able to say yes. So in order to do that, you've got to set really good goals. And using Locke's goal-setting theory, you've got to train people. You've got to pick people with the right ability, and you've got to train them and give them the resources to make sure. So that's the input side. You've got to make sure that they're well trained. So the answer will always be yes. So investing in people is really critical. Getting results through other people. Do I need to train them? You bet you do. Is training my responsibility? Yes, it is. So if I get results through other people, this is step one almost. Then the second thing is if I do perform, will it lead to some outcomes? Well, of course, it really has to, in a kind of a behavior modification way. So if people do well, the leader needs to be a responder. We often talk about the term first responders to accidents, but leaders need to be first responders to performance. They need to be almost like an alarm system. When a performance happens, whether it's good or bad, they need to have a response to the performance. And this can often be rewards for individual. Rewards can be just a recognition or just a nod or some kind of a positive praise, but also in terms of behavior that one doesn't like is telling people that you don't like it, is a part of that outcomes for performance. Well, what outcomes, will I have? Well, you'll have a positive outcomes if you do this brilliant thing, but you'll also have a negative outcome if you fail to achieve goals. And then last of all, what about satisfaction? Do I really, am I really satisfied? Well, one thing is making sure that the rewards that people get are ones that they value, and finding out what people value is really important. So it has to do with their personal needs, but also as managers, we can be timely about it. How long do we wait? Maybe the annual appraisal before we tell somebody that they did something really well 6 months ago. So there's also social comparisons and personal expectations in terms of equity theory. So in the group, I'm comparing myself with the other people as to what responses and rewards they're getting. And I'm also comparing myself to an external group that is my reference group. So number 4 there, equity theory operates on individuals. So basically, eyes wide open, managers reading the room, reading the needs of the individual, reading how well people think they're being rewarded relative to everybody else, and making sure that these are tweaked. And they're the main things that we talked about in this element of the program. One of the things that I find is not concentrated upon is how do I motivate my stars? Obviously, I've got to motivate the problem people, motivate the cash cow people, but people often don't talk to you about motivating stars. And one of the things I find about high achievers is they often need as much attention as some of the problem people that you might have. Now, at one stage, you can leave stars alone and give them the right kind of tools to do the job. But there's often an assumption that stars are people who are totally confident, totally competent, and just need to be delegated to. Whereas my experience of stars is that they're often the most insecure in the group. Part of the reason that they deliver extraordinary performance is because of an insecurity. And one has to manage people, one has to identify what kind of star they have. So if you're managing a star who's totally competent and confident and has deep security within themselves, then there's a delegation approach to that. But if a person, in my experience, many stars are working off an insecurity, and it's worth trying to identify where the individual is coming from before one actually delegates and leaves them alone. We looked at the conflict approach, and this to me was really is a really important response tool, I suppose, of how we respond when we're thwarted, when we are thwarted for our desires and our needs. The thwarting of a need causes conflict. The conflict frustrates us, and it creates a response in some ways. So the response can be one of the 5 approaches on the model. And we have to be careful about how we respond. And my instinct is to always ask myself the question of how do I choose the right response style to the conflict. And I think a couple of things really are really important here. We should obviously consider the relationship. The relationship is really important. Um, Competing and dominating with somebody who's in a in a close relationship or a long-term relationship, which isn't a good long-term strategy. Um, Collapsing and giving in is often a very good strategy when you're making up after a conflict. But if the relationship is important, we have to be very careful about how we treat that relationship. And most of the relationships we have in business are longer term relationships. So beating somebody up isn't obviously a good idea. The second thing is what is the importance of the issue? So how important is the issue? If the issue is really very important, then standing one's ground is a vital part. So we may introduce collaboration as well into that, but standing one's ground becomes really important for issues that are life or death red line issues. And when the issue is unimportant, there doesn't seem to be a reason to expend lots of energy and create lots of conflict over situations like that. Some of the things we talked about were leadership and power. And French and Raven described leadership and power in terms of sources of power. That you can have a source of power with referent, expert, legitimate, reward, coercive power, and information power. And referent people can get other people to like them. Some people are attractive in terms of personality or attractive in terms of looks. They have kind of a capital about that. And people like pleasing them. And there's a power there. You can have access to my good looks and my personal charm, and I'll trade you something for that. So there's a bit of that. That's well known. But obviously expertise in an important area is critical source of power. It's a critical source of power. As is legitimate power. Being appointed as a manager. But managers have great resources. They can open up doors for people. And that legitimate power can give people authorization to do things. That's one of the great feelings about being appointed in a managerial role, is the ability to make things happen, that legitimate authority. And reward power is obviously financial reward power, power that you can give people tasty work that they like doing, and can be really an important resource. Coercive power, people often think about it being as not much used form of power. And yet I think it's used all the time. I mean, discipline is often used as a coercive power on individuals. Or there's an implied threat in people that I withdraw from you. I'll take away my attention, or I'll take away my, let's call it my affection for you. That can be a coercive power. So in other words, that meant that some kind of nasty thing, well, it's something that you like doing, will be withdrawn. And that's a coercive power. I'll force you, you'll feel pain. And people do this in organizations all the time. And also there's information power, that people who attract information. And political animals are good at this. They find out what's happening. They look around corners and find out what's happening in the organization. And they harvest information. And they use this as a power and sell it for people's attention. So we talked a little bit about this in the context of managing one's boss. And that's kind of important, really, isn't it? Managing one's boss. And we looked at Grace and Landon. But the article that Cotter wrote about this is so important, is that clever politicians in terms of managing their boss understand one thing when they join an organization, that being promoted to the top of the organization does not necessarily mean that you become the most important or most powerful person in the organization. So when you notice, as Cotter's article says, when you notice that your boss has dependencies, that's a signal that you could take control over those dependencies and become like paracetamol to your boss's headaches. And the boss then knows that if I get rid of this person, that there's a headache attached to that person going away. So you become important, you become more important, and then you can trade. And there's a certain coercion almost about this, but you're coercing from the ground up. So political animals often use Cotter's ideas in this way, that they don't see power, they see dependency, and they get to manage the dependency. Important issue that. We talked a lot about negotiations, and one of the things to remember in negotiations is kind of often passed over, is negotiations can be seen in terms of two major styles, distributive and principled. And distributive the negotiations tend to be cutting the pie, dividing the pie, zero sum, you win, I lose situations. And clever negotiators in organizations tend to adopt what Fisher and Jury developed in the book Getting to Yes in 1986. And that's become the standard approach for negotiations. Obviously, there are a couple of principal messages they put across there that separate people from the problem. Negotiators don't get mad, they just get ahead. But critical among that is focusing on interests, not positions. Good negotiators don't focus on the position. They don't focus on the issue, like if it's about money or if it's about words of some kind. What they tend to do is they focus on what they want long term. So what one wants long term, for example, in negotiating a job offer, is I want to advance and I want ultimately to get a good salary and a good position. So I could use the negotiation over the salary as a proxy for that. That would be negotiating through a position. But my interest is long-term growth, long-term development, long-term advancement. So negotiating a situation like that and concentrating perhaps on things like a salary review after 6 months, negotiating about a development budget for myself, a path to promotion and advancement. Those things are focusing on interests, not positions. So inventing options for mutual gain, it's a really important part of that. So negotiating so that the employer sees that I'm actually seeing a mutual gain here in terms of the way I'm negotiating with this person. And the other thing is making sure that you're negotiating around objective criteria. Put numbers on everything so that you can't be flanneled out of advancement. Now, the critical thing to remember is the difference between interests and positions. So interests are a long-term direction in which you want to go, what you're trying to achieve long-term. And the position is something which is like the issue, like the money. The interest is what you're going to spend the money on, or what the money will symbolize. Just focusing on the money itself can be distributive in terms of in nature, and it can lose a person some benefit and some value. You can end up leaving value on the table in that situation. One of the things we talked a little bit about in our discussions are culture models, and the onion skin is not a bad way to to talk about culture. The bits you can see in culture tend to be the outside, the artifacts, the physical representation of the building, maybe even things like furniture, maybe things like uniforms, and maybe things like the outside behavior at meetings and in the organization. But it's a mistake to think that those physical things actually are there by accident. And they're often deeply connected to the deep assumptions. The assumptions that an organization has learned over years and years of existence from its major triumphs and its major defeats and tragedies. It has learned lessons about what works and what doesn't work, how people succeed and how they don't, how people are motivated and how they don't, how they're not, and how business actions, what business actions lead to success, and what rules, deep rules are there about life. And when you go into an organization, you almost hurt your shins on the coffee table of culture, because you get sudden reminders about what people regard as the way we do things around here. So the artifacts are very visible, that you can see it in cars, you can see it in parking spots, you can see it in the luxury of offices or lack of. And in the middle there are the values. These are sometimes explicit, we're aware of them. They find their way onto the wall in terms of the expression of what the company believes. But clever people reading a culture always tend to try to look for the discrepancies or conformity between the values on the wall and the behavior of people. To what degree is what they say around here actually acted out? And I often use the example, the chief executive often says, let's have more initiative around here. Well, people on the ground keep asking, what happened to the last person who showed initiative? And if that person thrived, then you can take it to the bank that that's a cultural norm, and it's based on a deep assumption about what works. But if the people who showed initiative got punished for making mistakes or whatever, then you can see that it's a counterfactual. It's a kind of there are woolly words, weasel words almost, or woolly words that actually are not true. They're speak, but they're not true. And so how do we change culture? Well, quite often you change culture by changing behavior, because assumptions are very deep. And it's very difficult to change assumptions because you often can't even get people to be explicit about them. But changing behavior on the front end eventually works backwards until it changes the assumptions. Very difficult to do, but it usually works by changing human beings. And when you change human beings, especially at the top of the organization, they ask for different behaviors. And especially in the honeymoon period, they tend to get it. And they do a thunder run, a blitz of changing behaviors. And after a while, people internalize the reasons why they're changing their behaviors. And you get culture change out of this approach. In our elective morning, we talked a little bit about coaching people and talking to people about their performance. And my instinct is that you're more successful in doing this when people actually decide to change performance by themselves, because it's their own idea. And one of the ways of doing this is to explain to them the situation and then to listen very carefully. And we talked about listening with listen, attend, reflect, explore, and summarize. When there's a situation to be solved, telling the person what you're talking about to them about, asking what the problem is, and then listening very carefully until you can summarize from their viewpoint what the issue is, about why the performance is not being delivered. And then you help them to generate some options. Most of the time you get them to generate the options and you get them to choose and commit to the option. And in that situation, you're able to get some kind of level commitment from individuals about doing an improvement. If you get some commitment, you're in a good position. Because individuals will actually implement what it is that they've committed to. So that was where the discussions on our elective day. In terms of the individual assignment, which I said I'd talk about, very important here that we try to send me the 200 words through the journal on Blackboard. And just a couple of points to make about this. Just please do read the brief. Really important that you zero in on what the brief's about. Summarize 2 theories in your assignment. When you're actually writing the assignment, remember the assignment wants you to summarize the 2 theories. And it's good to have those in your head before you go and do the interview. And rather than focus on the whole theory, which is very difficult, focus on some themes from the theories. So when you go down to when you go to formulate the questions and sit down with somebody, have some themes in your, like the theme is a part of the theory that you think is of interest to you. So interview them using these themes in your head. You're trying to find out where do your leaders and theories and where they converge with your academic theories, and where do your leaders' theories diverge from the academic theories. So where are they consistent with what you've read? Where are they inconsistent? How can the theories help your leader? Can they? In any way? How? And how can your leaders' innate approach inform theory? So is there anything good in what they do that your theories are missing out on? So read the brief so that you can actually follow and pick up these issues that we're talking about here. So that's basically it. Thanks for being here and for being a part of the group, and thanks for showing up for this session. I'm delighted that you made it here, and I hope it's been helpful. Thanks very much.